The story I am about to tell you is not a work of fiction. It is a meticulously researched account of a man who, from the grimy streets of New York's Lower East Side, engineered the very blueprint of organized crime in America. His name was Salvatore Lucania, but the world would come to know him by a different moniker, one that hinted at his uncanny ability to evade justice and his ruthless ambition, Lucky Luciano. He was the cold, calculating architect who took the chaotic, tribal violence of the early gangsters and forged it into a corporate-style syndicate, a national crime network so efficient and so deeply embedded in the fabric of American society that its shadow still lingers in some forms to this very day. This is the story of his rise, his reign, and his ultimate downfall, a saga of brutal power, visionary strategy, and the fragile, often bloody, alliances that held an empire of crime together. To understand Lucky Luciano is to understand a pivotal, dark chapter in American history, a time when the underworld was reorganized with the precision of a Fortune 500 company, and its board of directors were men who thought nothing of ordering a murder before lunch. Our journey begins not with a bang, but with the quiet, hopeful journey of a family seeking a better life. Crossing the Atlantic Ocean from the sun, drenched villages of Sicily to the overwhelming, teeming chaos of New York City at the turn of the 20th century. Imagine the scene, the air thick with the smells of salt water, engine smoke, and the palpable anxiety of thousands of immigrants crammed into the steerage deck of a steamship, their eyes fixed on the distant promise of the Statue of Liberty. Among them were Antonio and Rosalia Lucania and their young children, including a wide-eyed boy named Salvatore, who was just 9 years old when he first set foot on Ellis Island in 1906. They were poor, they spoke no English, and they were utterly unprepared for the harsh realities of their new home. They settled in a cramped tenement apartment on the Lower East Side, a neighborhood that was less a melting pot and more a volatile stew of competing ethnic groups: Italians, Irish, Jews, all fighting for the same scraps in a city that seemed to offer both boundless opportunity and crushing poverty in equal measure. For young Salvatore, the American dream was a distant myth. His reality was the crowded, noisy, and often dangerous streets. He was a bright boy, sharp and observant, but he quickly learned that in this environment, formal education held little value compared to the street smarts needed to survive. He dropped out of school in the 5th grade and turned to the only path that seemed to offer both respect and a steady income: petty crime. He started small, running errands for local gangsters, shining shoes, and then quickly graduating to shoplifting and extorting protection money from other, younger Jewish kids on the street with his small gang. It was here that he first began to display the traits that would define his career: a preference for organization over mindless violence, and a keen understanding that profit was the ultimate goal. He wasn't a brawler, he was a businessman in the making, and his first real step into the big leagues came when he formed a crucial partnership with a young, equally ambitious Jewish kid from the neighborhood, Meyer Lansky. Together, they would form one of the most formidable and enduring criminal partnerships in history. Lansky, the financial genius with a mind for numbers, and Luciano, the strategic visionary with an eye for opportunity, complemented each other perfectly. They started with a simple protection racket, but their ambitions were far grander than shaking down pushcart vendors. They saw the potential in the vices of the city: gambling, prostitution, and most importantly, bootlegging, which was about to become the golden goose of American crime with the dawn of Prohibition in 1920. But before he could ascend to the heights of power, Luciano had to navigate the treacherous world of the old world mafia, the Mustache Pete's, as they were disdainfully called by the younger, American-born gangsters. These older bosses, like Giuseppe, Joe the Boss, Masseria, were stuck in their traditional Sicilian ways, distrusting of non-Italians and obsessed with petty squabbles and codes of honor that, to Luciano's modern mind, only got in the way of making money. To gain entry into this powerful circle, Luciano knew he had to prove his worth, and he did so in the most brutal fashion, taking on dangerous assignments as a hired gun and enforcer for Masseria. It was during this time, in 1929, that his life would take a dramatic and near fatal turn, an event that would forever cement his legendary nickname, Lucky. He was kidnapped, beaten, tortured, and left for dead on a beach in Staten Island, his throat slashed from ear to ear. Miraculously, he survived, found by a police officer, and rushed to the hospital. He never spoke a word about who was responsible, adhering to the criminal code of omerta. But the event sent a clear message to the underworld. Luciano was a player and a target. His survival was seen as a sign of his invincibility, his luck. From that day forward, he was no longer Salvatore Lucania, he was Lucky Luciano, a man who had cheated death and was now ready to reshape the underworld in his own image, setting the stage for a bloody war that would forever change the face of organized crime in America. The near-death experience on that Staten Island beach did not soften Lucky Luciano. Instead, it hardened his resolve and crystallized his ambition. Surviving the brutal attack was more than just a personal triumph. It was a strategic windfall that elevated his status from a promising lieutenant to a legendary figure, a man seemingly touched by destiny. As he convalesced, his mind, always calculating, began to formulate a plan far more audacious than any street-level racket. He saw the old world mafia, embodied by the two warring chieftains Giuseppe, Joe the Boss, Masseria, and Salvatore Maranzano, as dinosaurs on the verge of extinction. Their constant, bloody squabbling over meaningless territory and outdated notions of honor was bad for business. The Castellammarese War, as their conflict was known, was costing money and drawing far too much unwanted attention from the authorities. Luciano, along with his inner circle of young, progressive mobsters, the cerebral Meyer Lansky, the ruthless Benjamin, Bugsy, Siegel, the steady Vito Genovese, and the pragmatic Frank Costello, saw a future where crime was not a series of tribal skirmishes, but a streamlined, corporate enterprise. They were Americans first and Italians second, and their god was not tradition, but profit. Luciano understood that to achieve this vision, the old guard had to be removed. a concept he would later chillingly refer to as taking the gun out of politics. His plan was one of breathtaking betrayal and cold-blooded realpolitik. He was officially a loyal soldier in Masiria's camp, but secretly, he opened communications with Maranzano, playing both sides against each other with the skill of a master chess player. He fed Masiria just enough information to stay in his good graces, while simultaneously assuring Maranzano of his eventual support. The endgame was set for April 15, 1931. Luciano had lured Joe the boss to a lunch meeting at a Coney Island restaurant, a seemingly innocuous gathering between a boss and his trusted capo. They ate, they talked, and then Luciano excused himself to the restroom. At that precise moment, 4 gunmen, allegedly including Siegel and Genovese, walked into the restaurant and opened fire on Masiria, pumping bullet after bullet into him until he lay dead on the floor, a deck of playing cards scattered around his body. With Masiria gone, the war swiftly ended, and Salvatore Maranzano declared himself the boss of all bosses, a title he bestowed upon himself in a grandiose ceremony where he anointed the leaders of the newly formed 5 families of New York. For a brief moment, it seemed like peace had arrived. Maranzano, however, was not the modernizer he pretended to be. He was, in fact, more steeped in ancient Sicilian traditions than Masiria had been, and he quickly grew suspicious and envious of Luciano's immense influence and his close ties with non-Italian allies like Lansky. He saw Luciano not as a partner, but as the most significant threat to his newfound power. Unbeknownst to Luciano, Maranzano had already drawn up a death list, and at the very top was Lucky's name. He hired a team of Irish hitmen from the notorious Vincent Mad Dog Cole gang to eliminate Luciano and his key lieutenants, planning the hits for September 10, 1931. But Luciano's network of informants was superior. Meyer Lansky, who had cultivated sources everywhere, got wind of the plot and immediately alerted Luciano. Faced with an imminent death sentence, Luciano realized that the old world could not be reformed. It had to be eradicated. He and Lansky decided to strike first, and they did so with breathtaking speed and audacity. They understood that Maranzano would never expect an attack in his own fortified office, and they knew that using his own planned method, non-Italian hitmen who wouldn't be recognized, was the perfect camouflage. On the afternoon of September 10, just hours before Maranzano's hit squad was supposed to kill him, Luciano sent 4 Jewish gangsters posing as IRS agents to Maranzano's office in the New York Central Building. They disarmed his bodyguards, and in a short, brutal struggle, they stabbed and shot the boss of all bosses to death in one single bloody day, later known as the Night of the Sicilian Vespers. Luciano and his allies not only eliminated Maranzano, but also systematically hunted down and killed dozens of old school mafia loyalists across the country, consolidating their power in a stunning coup d'état. The old world was dead. The path was now clear for lucky Luciano, the survivor, the strategist, the kingmaker, to build his own. With the old guard ruthlessly swept away, the underworld lay at lucky Luciano's feet, not as a conquered kingdom to be ruled by a single dictator, but as a vast, untamed frontier ready for a new system of governance. Luciano, the ultimate pragmatist, had no desire to become another boss of all bosses. He had just orchestrated the downfall of two men who had craved that very title. He understood that a single, centralized point of power was inherently unstable, a constant target for ambitious underlings, and a glaring focal point for law enforcement. His vision was far more revolutionary, a collaborative, corporate board for American crime. This was the genesis of the Commission, a concept that would cement his legacy as the true architect of modern organized crime. In late 1931, he gathered the most powerful crime lords in the nation, not in a secret basement, but in a grand meeting at Chicago's Blackstone Hotel, a symbol of his desire to move their operations into the mainstream. The attendees were a who's who of the criminal elite from New York, the heads of the 5 newly solidified families: Luciano himself, Joseph Bonanno, Joseph Profassi, Tommy Gagliano, and Vincent Mangano. From Chicago, the formidable Al Capone, and from other major cities, bosses like Abner Longi, Zwilman from New Jersey, and Charles King Solomon from Boston. The Commission was to be a supreme council, a governing body that would oversee all organized criminal activity in the United States. Its primary purpose was to mediate disputes, delineate territories, and approve or veto major undertakings, particularly nationwide rackets like narcotics, which required a complex cross-country infrastructure. This system replaced the law of the jungle with a set of cold, business-like bylaws. War between families was now forbidden unless sanctioned by the Commission. Murder of a made man required the board's approval to prevent chaotic cycles of revenge. Perhaps most importantly, and true to Luciano's own history of partnership, the Commission formally recognized and integrated powerful non-Italian syndicates, most notably the Jewish mob led by his lifelong ally Meyer Lansky and Louis Lepke, Butchalter of Murder, Inc., and later influential African, American, and Irish gangs in certain territories. This was a stark break from the parochial, Sicilian-only policies of the Mustache Petes, and it vastly increased the scope and efficiency of the national criminal network. With this new, stable structure in place, Luciano turned his attention to systematizing the operations of his own family, the Luciano crime family, which would later become known as the Genovese family. Often considered the most powerful and sophisticated of the 5 families, he organized it with the precision of a major corporation, creating a clear chain of command. Under him were the underboss and the consigliere, or advisor. Below them were the caporegimes, or captains, who managed individual crews of soldiers, who were the foot soldiers of the family. Each crew was responsible for its own set of rackets: gambling, loan sharking, labor racketeering, extortion, and kicked a percentage of their earnings up the chain to Luciano. This corporate ladder provided insulation. A soldier arrested for a street-level crime could rarely implicate the top bosses, as orders were passed down through multiple layers of buffer. To handle the more permanent problems that arose, Luciano and Lansky formalized a terrifyingly efficient solution: Murder Incorporated. This was a specialized, nationwide enforcement arm comprised of cold-blooded killers, many from the Brownsville neighborhood of Brooklyn, who operated as freelance assassins for the commission. If a boss in New York needed a problem in Los Angeles eliminated, he wouldn't send his own men. He would put in a contract with Murder, Inc., and their anonymous, traveling hitmen would carry out the execution, leaving no local trail back to the commissioning party. This was industrial-scale murder, divorced from passion and dedicated purely to business maintenance. Under this new, orderly regime, the profits soared to unprecedented heights. Luciano's empire was a vast, dark mirror of a legitimate conglomerate, with its board of directors, its corporate bylaws, its specialized departments, and its ruthless efficiency. For a few brief years, Lucky Luciano wasn't just a gangster. He was the chairman of the board of a secret, multi-billion-dollar criminal corporation that operated with impunity from the streets of New York to the shores of California, all while he lived the life of a king, holding court in top, rated restaurants and nightclubs, his power absolute and his influence seemingly untouchable. But this very success, this brazen flaunting of power, was also constructing the walls of his own prison, drawing the relentless gaze of one man who was as dogged and incorruptible as Luciano was cunning and ruthless, New York Governor Thomas E. Dewey. The gilded cage of Luciano's power, so meticulously constructed, began to show its first cracks, not from a rival's bullet, but from the relentless, methodical pressure of the law as the 1930s progressed. The sheer scale and brazenness of organized crime could no longer be ignored by the authorities. While local police were often corrupted or intimidated, a new breed of prosecutor was emerging, one with national ambition and a taste for high-profile targets. The man who would become Luciano's nemesis was Thomas Edmund Dewey, a young, fiercely ambitious, and utterly incorruptible special prosecutor. Dewey understood that to take down a kingpin like Luciano, you couldn't get him for the murders he had ordered or the large-scale bootlegging he had masterminded. The evidence was too well hidden, the witnesses too terrified. Instead, Dewey chose to attack the foundation of Luciano's empire from its most vulnerable and most sordid flank: prostitution. For years, Luciano had been consolidating the city's sprawling, chaotic vice rackets, bringing them under the systematic control of his organization through a brutal enforcer named David, Little Davy, Batillo. This was not about moral outrage. For Luciano, it was simply another revenue stream, another business to be organized and taxed. But for Dewey, it was the perfect avenue for attack. The sex trade was street level, with countless vulnerable witnesses, madams, bookers, and prostitutes, who could be flipped with the promise of clemency or the threat of long prison sentences. Dewey's team launched a massive investigation, raiding brothels, intercepting ledgers, and methodically building a web of financial records and witness testimonies that pointed directly upward to the man they called Charlie Lucky. The break came when they managed to flip some of the key figures in the ring, including a madam named Cokie Flo Brown and a booker named Pete Harris, who provided detailed accounts of how the system worked. how the money flowed up through Batillo and then to Luciano's top aides, and how Luciano himself had presided over meetings where the rules of the vice combine were laid down. Dewey knew a direct link would be hard to prove, but he was betting on a mountain of circumstantial evidence and the powerful testimony of numerous small players to overwhelm the defense. On the night of April 1st, 1936, Luciano was arrested in Hot Springs, Arkansas, where he had believed himself to be untouchable, protected by corrupt local officials. After a legal battle over extradition, he was brought back to New York in chains to face trial on 90 counts of compulsory prostitution. The trial that followed was a media circus, dubbed the trial of the century. Dewey, a masterful showman in the courtroom, meticulously presented his case, painting Luciano not as a sophisticated businessman, but as the vile king of a vast vice network that exploited hundreds of women. Luciano's defense team, led by the famed lawyer George Levy, fought back hard, cross-examining the state's witnesses and highlighting their sordid backgrounds and the deals they had made for their testimony. They argued that Luciano was being framed, that he was too big to be involved in something as tawdry as prostitution. But Dewey's narrative was powerful and simple. In his closing argument, he pointed at Luciano and declared him the mastermind, the man who profited from the misery of others. The jury was convinced. On June 7, 1936, after deliberating for nearly 9 hours, they returned with a guilty verdict on 62 counts. The following week, Judge Philip McCook delivered a stunning blow, sentencing Lucky Luciano to a term of 30 to 50 years in state prison, one of the longest sentences ever handed down for a vice charge. As he was led away from the courtroom, the man who had organized crime in America, who had sat at the pinnacle of power, was now just convict number 92168, headed for the grim confines of Clinton State Prison in Dannemora, New York, known as Little Siberia for its harsh, remote location. It seemed like the final, ignominious end for Lucky Luciano. His empire, however, did not crumble. From behind bars, using a complex web of trusted messengers, including the visiting Meyer Lansky and corrupt guards, Luciano continued to exert a significant degree of control over his criminal affairs. Vito Genovese became the acting boss, but major decisions still required the approval of the man in the cell. Yet, the world was changing. The United States was edging towards World War II, and the same strategic mind that had organized the Mafia was about to be offered a bizarre and unprecedented opportunity to trade his criminal expertise for a chance at freedom, an opportunity that would arise from the burning hulls of American ships in New York Harbor. The grim, gray walls of Dannemora were designed to break a man's spirit, to sever him completely from the world he once knew. But for Lucky Luciano, they became an unlikely command center. While his body was confined to a prison cell, his mind and influence, channeled through a steady stream of carefully vetted visitors and complicit guards, continued to operate the levers of his vast empire. Meyer Lansky became his most frequent and important conduit to the outside, their meetings disguised as social visits, but in reality, serving as high-level strategy sessions where the future of the syndicate was planned. Through Lansky, Luciano approved of major business decisions, mediated disputes between the other families, and ensured that his financial interests were meticulously managed, with his cut of the profits being funneled into secure accounts. This remote control was a testament to the corporate structure he had built. The organization could function efficiently even with its CEO behind bars. But as the 1940s dawned and the storm clouds of World War II gathered, an event occurred that would present Luciano with the most unexpected and paradoxical opportunity of his life. On the night of February 9, 1942, the French liner SS Normandy, which was being converted into a troop ship, renamed the USS Lafayette, caught fire under mysterious circumstances, capsized at its pier on the Hudson River, and became a total loss. The sight of the magnificent ship lying on its side, a symbol of American military potential crippled before it could even sail, sent shockwaves through the nation's security apparatus. Naval intelligence was gripped with a feverish fear that Nazi saboteurs and sympathizers were operating with impunity along the New York waterfront, one of the most critical logistical hubs for the Allied war effort. The docks were a tangled, violent world, controlled by corrupt union bosses and gangsters, a place where the police and the FBI had little to no reach. It was an environment where traditional law enforcement methods were useless. In desperation, Commander Charles R. Haffenden of the Office of Naval Intelligence conceived of a radical, almost unthinkable plan. To fight the underworld, you had to enlist the underworld. They needed someone who could guarantee cooperation, someone who could issue orders that every longshoreman, union official, and dockyard thief would obey without question. That someone was Lucky Luciano. The proposition was simple, audacious, and fraught with moral ambiguity. Luciano would use his unparalleled influence to secure the waterfront against sabotage and provide intelligence from his Italian contacts for the upcoming Allied invasions in Sicily and Italy. In return, he would be moved to a more comfortable prison, and implicitly, there was the promise of a closer look at his case when the war was over. The negotiations were delicate, conducted through a series of secret meetings between naval intelligence officers and Luciano's lawyer, Moses Polikoff, with the tacit approval of Governor Thomas Dewey himself, the very man who had put him away. Luciano, ever the pragmatist, immediately saw the immense value in this deal. He agreed without hesitation. Orders were sent down through the syndicate's chain of command, and an invisible shield was thrown over the New York and New Jersey docks. The theft of military supplies, once rampant, virtually ceased. Union bosses were instructed to report any suspicious activity or unfamiliar faces, and the word went out that anyone involved in sabotage would be dealt with by the mob in the most final way imaginable. The cooperation extended far beyond the docks. As planning for Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily, intensified, Luciano's deep-rooted connections in the old country became an invaluable intelligence asset. Through his network, contact was made with influential Sicilian mafiosi, many of whom had been persecuted by Mussolini's fascist regime and were eager to aid the Americans in ousting him. These contacts provided detailed maps, information on coastal defenses, and even offered to act as guides for the invading U.S. troops. The invasion was a spectacular success, and many military strategists later acknowledged that the intelligence provided through these underworld channels had been crucial in minimizing Allied casualties. The Mafia, in a bizarre twist of history, had become an unofficial instrument of American military policy. When the war finally ended in 1945, the Navy formally acknowledged Luciano's contribution, stating that his aid had been of a substantial nature and had helped to save many lives. This official recognition became the cornerstone of a massive legal campaign for his freedom. A petition for clemency was filed, arguing that his patriotic service warranted commutation of his sentence. The debate ignited a firestorm. Thomas Dewey, now a national political figure and a future presidential candidate, was in a difficult position. To deny clemency would be to disregard the sworn statements of naval intelligence officers, but to grant it would be to acknowledge a deal with the devil. After much deliberation, and likely for his own political reasons, Dewey agreed. On January 3, 1946, he commuted Luciano's sentence on the condition that he would not appeal the deportation order that had been pending against him since his conviction. Lucky Luciano was a free man, but he was also an exile, banished forever from the country he had helped to shape, both in its shadows and in its hour of need. He was put aboard the Laura Keene, a cargo ship bound for Italy, closing one chapter of his life and opening a final, tumultuous act in the land of his birth. The journey across the Atlantic in February 1946 was a starkly different experience from the one Salvatore Lucania had made 4 decades earlier. Then, he was a hopeful child entering a land of promise. Now he was Charles Lucky Luciano, a convicted felon and national celebrity, being forcibly expelled from the nation he considered his home. The Laura Keene, a Liberty ship, was his vessel of exile, and its arrival in Naples was met with a media frenzy he had not anticipated. He was greeted not as a returning son, but as a notorious American gangster, a living legend whose infamy had preceded him. The Italian authorities, wary and suspicious, kept him under constant surveillance, believing he had come to establish a new criminal empire on their soil. They could not have been more mistaken in their initial assumptions. Luciano was adrift, a king without his kingdom. He was given a small apartment in Naples, a far cry from the luxurious suites of Manhattan's Waldorf, Astoria, where he had once held court. For a man of his immense energy and ambition, the forced idleness was a new form of prison. He was cut off from the day-to-day operations of his syndicate, his power now diluted and delegated to the men he had left behind, primarily Frank Costello and Vito Genovese. His initial attempts to engage in legitimate business in Italy were met with resistance and bureaucratic hurdles, often instigated by the ever-watchful authorities who denied him the necessary permits. He invested in a small film company, dabbled in a shipping line, and even looked into purchasing a chain of cinemas. But these ventures were shadows of the colossal enterprise he had once run. The reality of his exile began to sink in deeply. He was a figurehead, revered in stories, but stripped of his executive power. Yet, the criminal mind that had built the commission could not be entirely subdued. While he did not seek to directly control the Italian Mafia, his presence alone was a gravitational force that altered the landscape of European organized crime. He became an elder statesman, a consultant of sorts, ambitious Sicilian mafiosi, rebuilding their power after the fall of Mussolini, sought his counsel and his blessing. American gangsters traveling to Europe for heroin deals or to expand gambling operations made pilgrimages to Naples to pay their respects, seeking his wisdom and, tacitly, his approval. It was through these channels that Luciano slowly, carefully, began to re-establish a different kind of influence. He saw the immense potential in the burgeoning transatlantic heroin trade, a business that was becoming the new financial lifeblood of the Cosa Nostra, replacing the Prohibition-era profits of alcohol. Using his unassailable credibility and his connections on both sides of the ocean, he became a pivotal node in the infamous French Connection pipeline. He helped broker meetings between the Corsican drug manufacturers in Marseille, the Sicilian distributors who moved the product, and the American families who controlled the distribution networks in New York. He was not a street-level dealer nor a courier. He was the master strategist facilitating the alliances that made the entire globe-spanning operation possible. This role allowed him to regain a significant source of income and a measure of his former relevance, but it also painted an even larger target on his back: the American authorities, particularly the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, under the fiercely determined Harry J. Anslinger, watched his every move with a venomous intensity. Anslinger, who viewed drug trafficking as a supreme evil, had made Luciano his white whale. He stationed agents in Italy to monitor Luciano around the clock, intercept his mail, and bug his conversations, desperately trying to gather enough evidence to have him imprisoned elsewhere or to disrupt his operations. This constant surveillance became the backdrop of Luciano's final years. He lived a life of paradoxical celebrity, wining and dining in Naples' best restaurants, holding court with journalists and film producers who were fascinated by his myth, all while knowing that federal agents were watching his every move from a nearby table. He gave interviews, often romanticizing his past and carefully avoiding any admission of current wrongdoing, further sculpting his own legend. He spoke of his patriotism during the war, of his unjust persecution by Dewey, and of his desire to simply live out his days in peace. But peace would remain elusive. The very organization he had built was turning in on itself in his absence. Back in New York, a violent power struggle was brewing. Vito Genovese, who had fled to Italy himself to avoid a murder charge only to be extradited back after the war, was now free and ruthlessly consolidating power, aiming to take control of the family that bore Luciano's name and eliminate anyone still loyal to the old boss. Genovese saw Luciano's continued influence, even from across an ocean, as a threat. The respect Luciano commanded was a barrier to Genovese's absolute authority. This internal betrayal was a deeper wound to Luciano than any government prosecution. He was being systematically erased from the empire he had founded, his legacy threatened not by the law, but by the ambition of a man he had once considered a brother in arms. The king was in exile, and the courtiers were plotting to ensure he would never return, setting the stage for a final, lonely act under the warm, indifferent Italian sun. The final decade of lucky Luciano's life was a slow, protracted epilogue, a study in the corrosion of power and the loneliness of exile. The initial notoriety that had greeted him in Italy gradually faded into a monotonous routine of surveillance and strategic isolation. He split his time between his apartment in Naples and a more comfortable villa in Rome, but both were gilded cages, his every movement meticulously documented by a small army of Italian police and American federal agents working under the relentless directive of Harry Anslinger. The Federal Bureau of Narcotics was determined to ensnare him, convinced he was the mastermind behind the flood of heroin beginning to poison American cities. They tapped his phones, intercepted his letters, and planted informants in his social circle, yet the wily Luciano, with a lifetime of experience in avoiding electronic and human surveillance, proved to be an elusive target. He conducted his business in whispers during walks in public parks or through layers of trusted intermediaries, never directly handling drugs or money, always maintaining a careful, legal distance that frustrated his pursuers at every turn. This constant, oppressive watchfulness took a toll, transforming his life into a performance where he was always on stage, playing the part of a retired, misunderstood businessman. He cultivated an image of legitimacy, granting interviews to sympathetic journalists like Sid Fader, who would later co-author his largely sanitized biography, where Luciano carefully crafted his own mythos, emphasizing his wartime cooperation and downplaying his criminal empire. He became a tourist attraction in his own right. American visitors to Naples would sometimes seek him out for an autograph or a photograph, and he often obliged, a sad smile on his face, a living monument to a life he could no longer live. Yet beneath this placid surface, the currents of the underworld were shifting violently, and the news from America brought him nothing but anguish. The commission he had created to ensure peace was now the tool of his betrayal. Vito Genovese, driven by a bottomless ambition, was systematically dismantling Luciano's legacy. In 1957, Genovese orchestrated the brutal assassination of Albert Anastasia, the ferocious boss of what would become the Gambino family, while he was getting a shave in a Manhattan barber shop. This was not just a power grab, it was a direct challenge to the old order that Luciano represented. An order where such a move would have required commission approval. Then came the most stinging personal betrayal. Frank Costello, Luciano's longtime friend and acting boss, who had faithfully managed his interests for years, was forced into retirement after surviving an assassination attempt ordered by Genovese. The message was clear: the Luciano era was over. The culmination of this internal strife was the infamous Appalachian meeting in November 1957, where Genovese summoned over 100 Mafia bosses from across the country to a secluded estate in upstate New York to legitimize his authority. The meeting was a catastrophic failure, broken up by a suspicious state trooper, and its exposure blew the myth of the Mafia's invisibility wide open, leading to unprecedented federal scrutiny. For Luciano, watching from afar, it was the final proof that the corporate system he had built was being run into the ground by short-sighted, greedy men. The only solace in these years was the occasional visit from his old friend Meyer Lansky, who would travel to Italy to discuss business and, more importantly, to provide a living link to the world they had built together. These meetings were bittersweet. They were two old lions, their claws clipped, reminiscing about past glories and lamenting the chaotic state of their creation. Lansky, ever the financial wizard, ensured that Luciano continued to receive his share of the profits from their various ongoing ventures, including the lucrative Havana casino operations, which had become a new nexus of mob finance and fun. It was this connection that would lead to Luciano's final, brief taste of his former life. In 1946, he had been smuggled into Cuba for a massive underworld summit, a gathering of the American mob's top echelon to discuss the future of their investments and to pay homage to the exiled king. For a few weeks, Luciano was back in his element, holding court at the Hotel National, surrounded by the likes of Lansky, Costello, and Santo Trafficante Jr. He was treated with the reverence of a founding father, and it must have felt, for a fleeting moment, like he had never left. But the joy was short-lived. Anslinger and the American government, upon discovering his presence in a country so close to the U.S. mainland, went ballistic. They brought immense diplomatic pressure to bear on the Cuban government, threatening to embargo the vital medical drug trade if Luciano was not immediately expelled. Once again, he was forced to leave, boarding a plane back to Italy, his second exile even more bitter than the first. That failed Cuban sojourn marked the true end of his active influence. After that, a profound weariness seemed to settle over him. The constant battles with the law, with his rivals, with his own past, had drained him. He began to speak more frequently of his mortality, of the pointlessness of it all. The great Lucky Luciano, the architect of organized crime, was now just a tired, homesick old man, waiting for an end that he knew could not be too far away, his thoughts forever drifting back to the chaotic, vibrant streets of New York that had forged him and that he would never see again. The final years of Charles Lucky. Luciano's life were characterized by a deepening sense of isolation and a gradual fading of the formidable energy that had once defined him. The relentless pressure from international law enforcement, coupled with the bitter sting of betrayal from his own kind, had worn down even his legendary resilience. He continued to live under the watchful eyes of the authorities, a permanent resident in a gilded cage of his own notoriety, moving between Naples and Rome. But the fire of ambition that had once burned so brightly was now reduced to embers. His primary concerns shifted from building empires to managing his legacy and securing his personal comfort, largely funded by the steady stream of revenue that Lansky, ever the loyal friend and meticulous financier, ensured found its way to him from their various remaining enterprises, particularly the lucrative casinos in Havana. He spent his days in a routine that was both mundane and surreal. He would hold court at a preferred cafe in Naples, the Gran Caffa Gambrinus, where locals and curious tourists alike could glimpse the legendary gangster, now a portly, well-dressed gentleman in his 60s, sipping espresso and reading the newspapers. He became a fixture, a living piece of history, yet he was increasingly disconnected from the present, his thoughts often drifting to the past, to the bustling streets of the Lower East Side, the smoky backrooms of New York's speakeasies, and the pinnacle of his power when his word could dictate the flow of illicit commerce across a continent. The news from America continued to bring him a mixture of grim satisfaction and sorrow. The Appalachian fiasco had indeed triggered a relentless federal assault on the very organization he had structured, and he watched from a distance as Vito Genovese's hubris led to his own downfall. In 1959, Genovese was finally convicted on narcotics charges, largely based on the testimony of a lower-level drug peddler, and was sentenced to 15 years in prison, a fate Luciano saw as poetic justice for the man who had betrayed him. Yet there was no triumph in this, only a hollow acknowledgement that the world he had built was cannibalizing itself. The modern mafia was becoming sloppier, more violent, and far more vulnerable, a far cry from the disciplined, business-like syndicate he had envisioned. This realization filled him with a profound sense of melancholy, a feeling that his life's work, for all its infamy and power, was ultimately being dismantled by lesser men. His health began to decline noticeably. The years of stress, the prison term, and the lifestyle had taken their toll. He developed heart problems and was often short of breath, a stark contrast to the vigorous young man who had once ruled the underworld with an iron will. In early 1962, he began making plans for what would be his final project, a Hollywood film based on his life. He met with a producer to discuss the potential movie, seeing it as a way to cement his version of his legacy for posterity. It was a curious endeavor, the king of crime seeking the validation of popular culture, and it highlighted his desire to be remembered not just as a gangster, but as a significant historical figure. On January 26, 1962, he traveled to the Capodichino airport in Naples to meet with the American film producer. They had dinner, discussing the possibilities for the film and Luciano, in a gesture that seemed to blend nostalgia with a business proposition, signed a contract giving his approval for the project. After the meeting, as he was walking through the airport, he suddenly collapsed, clutching his chest. The great Lucky Luciano, the man who had cheated death so many times, from the slashed throat on a Staten Island beach to the bloody purges of the Castellammarese War, had been felled by a massive heart attack. He was pronounced dead at the scene, his body lying on the cold, hard floor of an airport terminal, a world away from the New York cityscape that was his true kingdom. The news of his death reverberated across the globe, making front page headlines from New York to Rome. The official story was a heart attack, but in the shadowy world he inhabited, rumors and conspiracy theories blossomed immediately. Some whispered that he had been poisoned, assassinated by the same narcotics traffickers he had been working with, perhaps on the orders of a rival or even by the CIA to prevent him from revealing the full extent of his wartime cooperation. Others speculated that Vito Genovese, from his prison cell, had ordered the hit to finally erase his predecessor. However, no credible evidence ever emerged to support these theories. The most likely, and in many ways the most poignant, explanation was the simplest: his heart. Worn out by a lifetime of immense pressure, high stakes, and recent disillusionment, had simply given out. His body was returned to New York, the city he had longed for throughout his exile, but only in death. The Church, however, refused him a Catholic burial in the city, deeming his life of crime incompatible with a funeral mass. His family was forced to hold a small, private service at a funeral parlor in Manhattan, attended only by a handful of relatives and old associates, a stark and quiet end for a man whose life had been so loud with power and violence. His body was then laid to rest in St. John's Cemetery in Queens, in a modest mausoleum, not far from the final resting places of other mob legends like John Gotti and Vito Genovese. The architect of modern organized crime was finally home, but the empire he left behind was already fracturing, a testament to the fact that even the most carefully laid plans cannot outlast the mortal flaws of the men who inherit them. The death of Lucky Luciano did not bring silence. Instead, it unleashed a torrent of reassessment, myth-making, and a bloody scramble for the pieces of the empire he had left behind. His burial in New York soil, though denied the sanctity of a church service, served as a powerful symbolic closing of a chapter and the violent opening of another. In the immediate aftermath of his passing, the underworld he had structured with such care entered a period of instability and turmoil that would have deeply disappointed its founder. With both Luciano and Vito Genovese, his primary rival, effectively gone, one dead, the other languishing in prison, a power vacuum erupted within the commission and the five families. The old guard, the men who had sat with Luciano in the 1931 meeting that established the peace, were fading away, replaced by a new generation that was often more impulsive and less strategic. The Luciano crime family, now officially known as the Genovese family, was thrown into a complex and often deadly leadership struggle. While the family retained its reputation as the most sophisticated and insulated of the New York syndicates, the internal jockeying for power was fierce, a clear departure from the clear lines of succession Luciano had envisioned. This period saw the rise of figures like Thomas III, Finger Brown, Lucis, and Carlo Gambino, men who were masters of manipulation and betrayal in their own right, but who lacked Luciano's overarching vision for a unified, corporate criminal nation. Gambino, in particular, would quietly become the most powerful boss of the 1970s, but his reign was built on the foundation Luciano had poured even as he operated within its framework. Meanwhile, the legend of Lucky Luciano began to ossify and grow in the public consciousness. transforming from a contemporary news story into an enduring American myth. The film project he had been pursuing at the time of his death eventually morphed into the 1972 movie, The Valachi Papers, which, while focusing on a different figure, brought the inner workings of the Cosa Nostra to a mass audience for the first time and cemented the popular image of the mob that Luciano had helped create. Later, his life would be dramatized more directly in films and television, often romanticizing his strategic genius and downplaying the brutal reality of his criminal enterprises. He became an archetype, the organized crime boss as CEO, a figure of cold calculation rather than hot-headed violence. This legacy is a double-edged sword. On one hand, historians and criminologists universally acknowledge his transformative role. He is credited with taking the neighborhood-based, ethnically clannish, Black Hand, extortion rings, and merging them into a streamlined national syndicate. His creation of the commission was a stroke of organizational genius, establishing a model for dispute resolution and collaborative enterprise that allowed organized crime to flourish on an unprecedented scale for decades. He professionalized violence through the creation of Murder, Inc., making it a detached business service function. His willingness to partner with non-Italian groups like the Jewish mob under Meyer Lansky broadened the talent pool and financial reach of the syndicate in a way the old mustache Pete's could never have conceived. Yet, on the other hand, this very success came at an immense human and social cost. The system he built was responsible for institutionalizing corruption in labor unions, ports, and municipal governments across the United States. It created a vast network for distributing narcotics that would wreak havoc on American cities for generations. The violence he systematized, while often portrayed as only affecting other gangsters, inevitably spilled over, destroying innocent lives and terrorizing communities. The romantic image of the gentleman gangster obscures the grim reality of the brothels he ran, the addicts his heroin trade created, and the countless victims of the murderous apparatus he commanded. Furthermore, his legacy is inextricably tied to the paradoxical deal he made with the U.S. government during World War II. This episode remains one of the most controversial aspects of his life, raising difficult questions about the moral compromises made in times of war and the unsettling reality that a nation's security apparatus sometimes must consort with its domestic demons to face an external threat. For Luciano, it was the ultimate demonstration of his power and influence. For the government, it was a necessary, if distasteful, tactical alliance. This complex tapestry, the visionary organizer, the ruthless capitalist of crime, the patriotic traitor, the exiled king, is what makes Lucky Luciano such a compelling and enduring figure. His story is a dark version of the American dream, a tale of an immigrant who used his intelligence and ambition to achieve immense power, only to be ultimately destroyed by the very system he mastered. He demonstrated that organization and structure could be more powerful than raw violence, a lesson that would be studied not only by future gangsters, but also by law enforcement agencies that had to evolve to combat the hydra he had created. The death of the man did not kill the blueprint. The shadow of the commission and the corporate model of organized crime would stretch long into the late 20th century, a ghost of Lucky Luciano's relentless, calculating, and utterly immoral mind. The enduring shadow that Lucky Luciano cast over the 20th century is a phenomenon that stretches far beyond the bloody internal politics of the five families and into the very architecture of modern law enforcement and popular culture. His death did not signal the end of organized crime. Rather, it forced the entity he had built to evolve, adapt, and in doing so, reveal its own vulnerabilities, which in turn shaped the legal tools used to combat it. The decades following his passing saw the Mafia reach what many consider its zenith of power and influence in the 1970s and early 1980s, with families controlling major labor unions, the concrete industry in New York, and vast gambling and loan sharking operations, all operating on the fundamental corporate structure Luciano had implemented. However, this very success, this embedding into the legitimate economy, also created a trail of financial evidence that a new generation of prosecutors was learning to follow. The downfall of the modern mafia can be traced directly to legal weapons that were, in part, forged in response to the sophisticated, insulated system Luciano designed. The racketeer-influenced and corrupt organizations act, known as RIO, became law in 1970, but its full power wasn't unleashed until the 1980s. RITO was the ultimate counter to Luciano's corporate model. It allowed prosecutors to target the entire organization as a continuing criminal enterprise, rather than having to convict individual members for discrete crimes. The man who had separated himself from street-level violence by layers of management found his legacy attacked by a law that pierced through all those layers, holding bosses responsible for the crimes they ordered but did not personally commit. This was the legal revolution that Luciano's structure ultimately provoked, and it led to the convictions of the very men who had followed him, from the heads of the commission like Anthony, Fat Tony, Salerno to the flamboyant John Gotti, who briefly captured the public's imagination in the 1980s before a Reixo case ensured he would die in prison. The other great vulnerability was the code of omerta that Luciano had so staunchly upheld after his own throat slashing. The Witness Protection Program, formalized in 1970, systematically dismantled this century's old wall of silence. Men like Joe Valachi, Sammy, the Bull Gravano, and countless others, facing the rest of their lives in prison under Reixo, chose to talk, providing the detailed, insider testimony that Luciano had always managed to avoid. The blueprint he created was so effective that it took the combined force of Reixo and the systematic breaking of omerta to seriously degrade it. In a cruel irony, the corporate ladder of insulation he built became a ladder for informants to climb, each rung representing a higher ranking boss they could implicate in exchange for a reduced sentence simultaneously. The legend of Lucky Luciano continued to be polished and commodified in the realm of fiction and film. He became the template for the cerebral, behind the scenes mob kingpin, a character archetype that would appear in countless books, movies, and television shows. Mario Puzo's iconic novel, The Godfather, and Francis Ford Coppola's subsequent film masterpiece, while not a direct biography of Luciano, is imbued with the structural and thematic realities of the world he engineered. The character of Vito Corleone, presiding over a meeting of the five families, is a direct narrative reflection of the commission. Michael Corleone's struggle to legitimize the family's business while maintaining its power through calculated, corporate-style violence is the central dramatic conflict that Luciano himself navigated. The film's famous line, "It's not personal, it's strictly business," could have been Luciano's own motto, a perfect summation of his philosophy that separated him from the old world, passion-driven mustache Pete's. Later, television shows like The Sopranos would explore the legacy of this world from the perspective of a modern boss grappling with the diminished, tarnished inheritance of the Luciano era. The great dreams of a national syndicate reduced to squabbling over garbage routes in New Jersey. This cultural immortality ensures that while the actual power of the American Mafia has waned significantly since the heyday of the 1950s and 60s, the image of the organized crime boss that Luciano epitomized remains potent and endlessly fascinating to the public. His life story forces a confrontation with a complex and uncomfortable part of the American narrative. The story of immigration, ambition, and the often blurred line between entrepreneurial genius and criminal enterprise. He was a product of a system that offered limited avenues for success to certain groups, and he exploited those limitations with breathtaking audacity. To study Lucky Luciano is to study the dark side of capitalism, the power of organization, and the enduring allure of the outlaw who operates by his own code, a figure who built an empire in the shadows, whose strategies were so effective they changed both the world of crime and the world of law, and whose name remains, and likely will forever remain, synonymous with the very idea of the American Mafia, and that allowed them to stay one step ahead of investigations. This deep-seated corruption, a direct outgrowth of the centralized power structure Luciano created, eroded public trust in institutions and created a cynicism about government that persists in some quarters to this day. Furthermore, Luciano's forward-thinking, multi-ethnic partnership with Meyer Lansky paved the way for the globalization of crime. The Havana casino operations, the Swiss bank accounts, the international narcotics pipelines. These were the early prototypes of the modern transnational criminal network. Luciano demonstrated that crime could be a borderless enterprise, and his successors and emulators around the world took this lesson to heart. The Colombian cartels, the Russian mafia, and Mexican drug trafficking organizations, while culturally and structurally distinct, all operate on the fundamental Luciano principle that crime is a business that requires strategic alliances, financial sophistication, and a willingness to use extreme violence as a corporate tool. His life also forced a moral and legal reckoning within the United States, compelling the justice system to innovate in ways previously unimagined. The Witness Protection Program and the Rights Statute are, in a real sense, Luciano's legacy, as much as the commission is, they are the monumental legal defenses built specifically to besiege the fortress he constructed. The long-term investigations, the use of electronic surveillance, the focus on financial records and conspiracy charges. All these tactics were refined and amplified in the war against the creature he had built. His story also presents a permanent and uncomfortable historical paradox: the alliance with the U.S. Navy during World War II. This episode remains a subject of intense debate among historians, a murky chapter where the clear lines between patriot and traitor, between public service and private deal, were irrevocably blurred. It asks a difficult question about the nature of power and necessity. To what extent can a democracy ethically employ the tools of its underworld to defend itself? There is no easy answer, and Luciano sits at the center of that dilemma, a symbol of the moral compromises that nations sometimes feel forced to make. In popular culture, his myth has been polished to a high sheen, often divorcing the man from the misery he helped orchestrate. He is frequently portrayed as the sharp-dressed, clever visionary, the man who brought order to chaos, while the brutal reality of his vice ring, the addiction spread by his narcotics network, and the corpses left by Murder, Inc., are often relegated to the background. This sanitization is a testament to the power of the narrative he himself helped craft, the narrative of the businessman, not the thug. The story of Lucky Luciano is therefore far more than a biography of a criminal. It is a critical case study in the mechanics of power, the vulnerabilities of a free society to organized corruption, and the enduring and often romanticized allure of the American outlaw. He was a dark catalyst whose actions, for better and overwhelmingly for worse, shaped the laws, the economy, the culture, and the very security apparatus of the United States, leaving a mark so deep that to understand modern America fully, one must first understand the shadowy architect who helped build its underworld in his own ruthless, pragmatic, and terrifyingly efficient image. To truly grasp the monumental figure that was Lucky Luciano, one must venture beyond the chronological timeline of his life and delve into the intricate tapestry of his personal character, the very psychological engine that drove his unprecedented rise and defined his cold, pragmatic worldview. He was a man of profound contradictions, a bundle of traits that seemed to conflict, yet somehow coexisted to form a uniquely formidable criminal mind. On the surface, he cultivated an image of calm, detached professionalism. He was not a loud, flamboyant braggart like Al Capone, nor a reclusive, paranoid schemer like later bosses. He was a man who preferred to operate from the shadows, his power emanating not from theatrical displays of violence, but from the quiet, unshakable certainty that his orders would be carried out. He was famously well mannered and impeccably dressed, understanding that appearance was a tool of legitimacy, a way to blend into the world of high society and corrupt politicians he needed to navigate. He could sit in a fine restaurant, charming his companions with his quiet charisma, all while his mind calculated profit margins and strategic eliminations. This outward calm, however, masked a will of iron and a capacity for ruthlessness that was absolute when the situation demanded it. The decision to orchestrate the murders of both Masseria and Maranzano was not born of hot, blooded rage but of cold, dispassionate calculus. They were obstacles to a greater vision, and thus they had to be removed with surgical precision. He did not relish violence, but he saw it as an essential business expense, a tool to be used efficiently and without remorse. This detachment was perhaps his greatest strength and his most chilling quality. He was able to separate his personal feelings entirely from his business decisions, a trait that allowed him to form alliances with former enemies and order the death of former friends without hesitation. His partnership with Meyer Lansky, a Jewish man, in the face of intense prejudice from the old world Sicilian bosses, was not a statement of progressive ideals, but a testament to his pure pragmatism. Lansky was brilliant and useful, and that was all that mattered. This same pragmatism defined his relationship with women. He never married, though he had many companions, fearing that a wife and children would become a vulnerability, a lever that could be used against him. His one great love was said to be a woman from his youth, but he sacrificed that personal connection on the altar of his ambition, choosing a life where attachments were liabilities. Yet, beneath this glacier of calculation, there existed a deep, abiding sense of loyalty to a very select few, a loyalty that was ultimately his most humanizing flaw. His unwavering trust in Meyer Lansky was the cornerstone of his entire operation, and that trust was never betrayed. Conversely, his initial trust in Vito Genovese, whom he had considered a brother, led to his greatest personal and professional betrayals. The bitterness of his exile was compounded by the knowledge that the empire he built was being dismantled by a man he had once elevated. In his later years, a deep sense of nostalgia and melancholy often overwhelmed him during his interviews. He spoke longingly of New York, not just as a territory, but as his home, the only place where he truly felt he belonged. This homesickness was the Achilles heel of the otherwise impervious kingpin, the one emotional need that his power and money could never satisfy once he was deported. He was, in the end, a tragic figure in the classical sense, a man whose greatest strengths, his vision, his intelligence, his pragmatism, led him to a pinnacle of power that was ultimately unsustainable and isolating. He achieved the American dream through a dark, twisted reflection of its principles, amassing immense wealth and influence through relentless ambition and innovation, only to be cast out from the nation. He sought to conquer and systematically erased from the organization he founded. The story of Lucky Luciano is not just a history of crime. It is a psychological portrait of a specific type of genius, one that is utterly compelling and profoundly terrifying, a mind that looked upon the chaotic world of American crime and saw not a problem, but a blueprint, and in realizing that blueprint, changed the nature of illicit power forever. The geographical and physical landscapes that shaped Lucky Luciano's life serve as a powerful, unspoken narrative of his rise and fall, each location a distinct chapter in his journey from obscurity to infamy, and finally to forlorn exile. It began on the cramped, teeming streets of New York's Lower East Side, a crucible of ambition where a dozen languages collided, and the air was thick with the smells of poverty and possibility. This was his first and most formative classroom, a place where the law was an abstract concept enforced by corrupt beat cops, and real power belonged to those who controlled the streets. The crowded tenements and bustling pushcart markets taught young Salvatore Lucania his first lessons in economics and territorial dominance. Here, he learned that a block was a kingdom and a neighborhood an empire waiting to be conquered. The very chaos of this environment bred in him a lifelong craving for order, a desire to impose a system on the anarchy that surrounded him. As he rose in power, his headquarters shifted accordingly, moving from street corners to the back rooms of nondescript social clubs, and then, audaciously, to some of the most prestigious addresses in Manhattan. His base of operations at the Barbizon Plaza Hotel and his regular, very public presence at the Waldorf Astoria, where he lived under the alias Charles Ross, was a brazen declaration of his arrival. He was no longer a tenement rat, he was a businessman, and he operated from the same venues as captains of industry and political leaders. This was a crucial part of his strategy, to normalize his presence, to blend his illicit power with legitimate society, making himself not a fugitive from the law, but a parallel authority existing in plain sight. The restaurants where he dined, the nightclubs where he held court, all became extensions of his boardroom, spaces where deals were struck and alliances forged under the glittering lights of the city he sought to control. Then came the stark, brutal shift to the cold, imposing walls of Clinton State Prison in Dannemora, a place known as Little Siberia, for its remote location and harsh conditions. This was a violent demotion, a physical manifestation of his defeat at the hands of Thomas Dewey. The endless, monotonous routine, the isolation from the vibrant life of New York, the loss of control. It was a form of psychological torture for a man whose identity was built on his autonomy and influence. Yet even here, his mind refused to be imprisoned. The prison became a different kind of headquarters, a place of quiet strategy where, through whispered conversations and coded messages, he maintained his grip on his empire and plotted the deal that would eventually secure his freedom. His eventual release and immediate deportation to Italy thrust him into a final, alien landscape. Naples, with its ancient streets and sun-drenched piazzas, was the land of his ancestors, but it was never his home. He was a stranger here, an American in everything but citizenship, a man out of time and place. The comfortable villa he acquired was a poor substitute for the bustling energy of New York. He was a ghost at the feast, a legendary figure from another world who was now forced to live a life of quiet observation, his power reduced to echoes and rumors. The Cappuccino airport, where he suffered his fatal heart attack, was the perfect, poignant setting for his final act. A man in transit, caught between worlds, forever stranded in a liminal space, never to reach the destination he truly longed for. And finally, his body was returned to the island of his birth, but only in death to be interred in a mausoleum in Queens, New York. The refusal of the church to grant him a full Catholic burial was a final, formal condemnation, a denial of absolution for a life lived in defiance of its tenets. His grave in St. John's Cemetery is a quiet, almost modest monument to such a tumultuous life, a permanent reminder that even the most powerful of men are ultimately reduced to the same silent fate. The journey from the chaotic, vibrant streets of the Lower East Side to the cold, silent marble of the mausoleum traces the arc of a monumental life, a journey through the very heart of the American century, leaving behind a legacy etched not in stone, but in the enduring structures of power, corruption, and organized crime that continue to fascinate and horrify the world to this day. His story is a map of the 20th century's dark side, with each location a pin marking a moment of triumph, a point of defeat, or a place of exile, collectively telling the story of the boy who dreamed of power and the man who learned too late its ultimate, isolating cost. The financial architecture of Lucky Luciano's criminal empire was as sophisticated and far-reaching as that of any major corporation of his era, a vast shadow economy that generated staggering sums of money and required a level of fiscal genius to manage and launder that reveled its legitimate counterparts. To understand the sheer scale of his wealth is to move beyond the romanticized image of suitcases full of cash and into the realm of a diversified, multinational conglomerate that profitably exploited every human vice and systemic weakness. The end of Prohibition in 1933 was not a death knell for his operations, but merely a corporate restructuring. The immense capital and distribution networks built on bootlegging were seamlessly diverted into other, even more lucrative ventures. The most significant revenue streams were a testament to his strategic vision. First and foremost was the national lottery, known as the numbers or policy racket, a poor man's gambling game that, when organized on a city-wide scale, generated a relentless, river-like flow of cash from the most impoverished neighborhoods, a cruel but highly effective tax on hope. Then there was labor racketeering, a masterstroke of parasitic capitalism where his control over key unions, like the International Longshoremen's Association and the Garment Workers, allowed him to extort businesses through the threat of strikes, embezzle union pension funds, and orchestrate massive theft from the docks, skimming a percentage from virtually every piece of cargo that entered or left the port of New York. Gambling was another pillar. From high-stakes floating craps games and clandestine casinos to wire services that bookmarked horse races across the country, all protected by a web of corrupt police and politicians. His foray into organized prostitution, while the charge that ultimately convicted him was actually a smaller, though still significant, part of his portfolio, an attempt to bring order and regular tribute from the chaotic vice districts. And looming over everything was the burgeoning narcotics trade, particularly heroin, which Luciano and his associates like Lansky and Genovese saw as the future, a high-profit, high-demand product with a global supply chain they were uniquely positioned to control. The real challenge, then, was not making the money, but cleansing it, a problem that fell to the financial wizardry of Meyer Lansky. Lansky was the architect of the mob's laundry service, a man who understood the global banking system better than most Wall Street executives. He pioneered methods of money laundering that are still used today, moving cash through a dizzying array of front companies. Legitimate, seeming businesses in linen supply, jukebox distribution, vending machines, and real estate that could account for the illicit cash as legitimate income. Profits were funneled through complex layers of shell corporations, often based in offshore havens like Switzerland and Cuba, where banking secrecy laws provided a veil of anonymity. The Havana casino operations, in particular, were a perfect laundering machine. Millions in dirty cash from the States could be brought to the casino cages and recorded as gambling winnings, emerging clean and ready for investment. This process of legitimization allowed Luciano and his inner circle to live like kings, investing in real estate, stocks, and legitimate businesses, further blurring the line between the underworld and the upper world. The flow of this capital was what truly cemented the power of the Commission. It wasn't just a council for resolving disputes. It was a central bank for crime, capable of financing massive ventures, bribing officials at the highest levels, and ensuring that every family and associate remained invested in the system's survival. The sheer volume of this untaxed, illicit capital had a corrupting influence on the legitimate economy, distorting markets and creating an uneven playing field where businesses backed by mob money could undercut honest competitors. When Luciano was deported, this financial network largely remained intact, managed by Lansky and others, ensuring that the exiled king continued to receive his substantial share, which allowed him to live comfortably in Italy. Though it was a pale imitation of the wealth and power he had once wielded, the relentless pursuit of this fortune by the government, first through tax evasion charges like those that finally caught Al Capone, and later through the financial forensic accounting enabled by Raicho, was the key to the mob's eventual decline. They could hide bodies better than they could hide money, and the trail of billions of dollars flowing from the numbers runners in Harlem to the dockyards of New Jersey to the banks of Switzerland was the ultimate evidence against them, a ledger of corruption that detailed a half-century of American crime and proved that the most dangerous weapon in Luciano's arsenal was not a gun, but a dollar bill. The human cost of Lucky Luciano's meticulously constructed empire forms a vast and somber counter, narrative to the tale of strategic genius and corporate innovation, a dark ocean of suffering whose depths remain largely unquantified, but whose reality is the true legacy of his life's work. For every board meeting held in a plush hotel suite, there was a back alley where a defaulting gambler was beaten to a pulp. For every $1 million laundered through a legitimate-looking business, there was a family bankrupted by a loan shark's exorbitant vig. For every political favor curried, there was a community living in fear of the corrupt and untouchable power that governed its streets. The most immediate victims were those ensnared in the vice rackets he controlled. The women in the prostitution ring that Dewey prosecuted were not willing entrepreneurs, but vulnerable human beings, often immigrants or runaways, trapped in a cycle of addiction, violence, and exploitation. Their lives a commodity to be bought and sold for the profit of a man who never had to see their faces. The narcotics trade, which Luciano helped systematize on a global scale, created waves of addiction that devastated neighborhoods for generations, ruining health, destroying families, and fueling property crime, all to feed the insatiable financial appetite of the syndicate. This was not a victimless crime. It was a public health crisis manufactured for profit. Beyond the direct victims of the syndicate's core businesses was the systemic corruption that poisoned entire cities. The control of unions meant that honest workers had to pay tribute to mobbed up officials for the privilege of earning a living, their hard-earned dues siphoned off into the pockets of men like Luciano. The racketeering in industries like garbage hauling and construction meant that every citizen and every business paid a hidden mob tax, inflating the cost of living and stifling genuine economic competition. The political corruption, which reached from the beat cop all the way to the halls of state legislatures, eroded the very foundation of democracy, teaching a generation that justice was for sale and that the powerful operated by a different set of rules. This culture of corruption created a pervasive cynicism and a breakdown of social trust that became one of the most enduring and damaging consequences of organized crime's ascendancy. Then there was the violence, the tool that underpinned the entire enterprise. While Luciano preferred to delegate this dirty work, the existence of Murder, Inc., and the countless unsolved homicides that stained the underworld are a permanent stain on his legacy. These were not cinematic, clean killings. They were brutal, messy affairs that left bodies in gutters, in car trunks, and on restaurant floors, traumatizing innocent bystanders and creating an atmosphere of terror. The victims of this violence were not only rival gangsters, they were witnesses who knew too much, business owners who refused to pay protection, and anyone else who stood in the way of the syndicate's interests. Each of these deaths sent a ripple of grief through a family and a community, a human cost that never appears on a balance sheet. Even Luciano's celebrated wartime cooperation, often framed as his redeeming act, carries a dark, complicating footnote. The intelligence provided through his mafia contacts in Sicily almost certainly smoothed the Allied invasion, but it also had the effect of empowering the very same mafia that Mussolini had suppressed. These same crime families, now indebted to and strengthened by their American allies, would go on to dominate post-war Sicily, entrenching a system of corruption and violence that plagues the region to this day. This unintended consequence illustrates the moral quagmire of such alliances. The short-term military gain came at the long-term cost of bolstering a criminal parasite that would suck the life out of Sicilian society for decades. Finally, we must consider the cost to Luciano himself. He achieved everything his ambitious young self could have dreamed of: power, wealth, respect, and influence. Yet he died a lonely, exiled man, betrayed by his protégés, separated from his homeland, and forever defined by the brutal system he created. The empire he built consumed him in the end, isolating him from genuine human connection and leaving him with a legacy that is, at its heart, a story of immense suffering inflicted upon countless unknown, forgotten people for the sake of power and profit. The true biography of Lucky Luciano, therefore, is not written in the history books that detail his corporate restructuring of the underworld, but in the silent, aggregate pain of all those whose lives were diminished, broken, or ended to make that restructuring possible. A haunting reminder that behind the legend of the master criminal lies a trail of human wreckage that forever negates the romance of his myth. The philosophical underpinnings of Lucky Luciano's worldview, though never formally articulated in a manifesto, can be pieced together from his actions and the cold, consistent logic that guided his entire criminal career, revealing a man who operated not from a place of chaotic evil, but from a chillingly coherent, albeit twisted, moral framework. At its core, his philosophy was a form of hyper-Darwinian capitalism, stripped of all social contract and ethical constraint, where the world was a jungle and the only sin was weakness. He did not see himself as a villain in a melodrama. He saw himself as a businessman and a visionary, providing services that a hypocritical society demanded but officially condemned. In his mind, he was simply satisfying a market need for gambling, loans, and vice, and he did so with an efficiency and organizational brilliance that his legitimate counterparts could only admire. This perspective allowed him to rationalize the immense suffering his empire caused. The drug addict was a customer, the beaten shopkeeper was a business expense, and the victim of murder, Inc., was a terminated employee or a resolved contractual dispute. His famous aphorism, often paraphrased as, "It's just business," was not a glib excuse, but the genuine operating principle of his soul. It was a philosophy that completely divorced action from consequence, allowing for a level of moral compartmentalization that enabled him to order a murder and then enjoy a fine meal without a trace of remorse, because the two acts existed in separate, non-intersecting realms of his life. This worldview was profoundly shaped by his upbringing on the Lower East Side, where he witnessed firsthand that the official authorities were either absent, corrupt, or predatory. The police were not guardians of justice, but another gang to be paid off or avoided. The government was a distant entity that had allowed his family to live in poverty. From this, he internalized the belief that all systems were ultimately corruptible, and that power was the only true currency. His entire life's work was a testament to this belief. He didn't fight the system from the outside. He built a better, more efficient one inside of it, a shadow government with its own laws, its own economy, and its own brutal form of justice. His creation of the Commission was the ultimate expression of this philosophy, a move from anarchic competition to a structured, albeit criminal, oligarchy, mirroring the trusts and cartels of the legitimate business world. His partnership with Meyer Lansky and other non-Italian gangsters was a radical application of pure meritocracy within this dark framework. He broke the tribal bonds of the old mafia, not for progressive ideals, but because he recognized that talent and utility were the only metrics that mattered in the pursuit of profit. This pragmatism extended to his personal life, where he avoided the trappings of family and deep romantic commitment, viewing them as vulnerabilities that could be exploited, as emotional leverage that could cloud his judgment. He built walls not just around his organization, but around his own heart, sacrificing the possibility of deep human connection for the sterile safety of absolute control. Even his patriotic service during World War II can be viewed through this lens of pragmatic self-interest. While it may have contained a genuine flicker of affection for his adopted country, the alliance with naval intelligence was, for Luciano, the ultimate business deal, trading a commodity he possessed, namely control and intelligence, for the most valuable currency imaginable, his freedom. It was the strategic masterstroke of a master negotiator, using the tools of the state to achieve his own ends. In his final years, the limitations of his philosophy became starkly apparent. The very system he built, founded on betrayal and raw power, inevitably produced a successor, Vito Genovese, who was more ruthless and less visionary, proving that the jungle ultimately consumes its own. Exiled and isolated, the man who believed only in power was left with none, and the businessman who dealt only in cold logic was left with the warm, aching pain of nostalgia and homesickness, emotions his philosophy had no room to process. The story of Lucky Luciano, therefore, is more than a chronicle of crime. It is a cautionary tale about a worldview that reduces all human interaction to transaction and all moral questions to calculations of power and profit. He demonstrated with terrifying clarity how far intelligence and ambition can go when utterly unmoored from conscience, and his legacy stands as a permanent, dark monument to the horrifying efficiency that can be achieved when a human being decides that everything and everyone has its price. The enduring fascination with Lucky Luciano, a figure who has been dead for over half a century, speaks to something deeper within the human psyche than a mere interest in true crime. He has been transformed into a complex symbol, a Rorschach test upon which society projects its own anxieties and conflicted feelings about power, success, immigration, and the very nature of the American dream. He is not remembered with the same uncomplicated revulsion as a serial killer or a terrorist, but with a strange, unsettling mix of condemnation and a grudging, often reluctant, admiration for his sheer audacity and transformative impact. This duality is the cornerstone of his myth. On one hand, he is the archetypal villain, the cold-hearted gangster who profited from human misery and corruption, a man whose actions left a lasting scar on the social fabric. On the other hand, he is the ultimate self-made man, the immigrant who rose from the most abject poverty to command a secret empire through nothing but his own intelligence, ambition, and force of will. A dark parallel to the stories of legitimate industrialists like Rockefeller or Carnegie, who also built fortunes by bending the rules and crushing competition. This makes him a profoundly ambiguous figure, one who forces us to confront the uncomfortable blurriness of the line between ruthless businessman and organized criminal. His story resonates because it is a perversion of a narrative we are taught to celebrate, the triumph of the underdog. He is the dark embodiment of the idea that in America, you can be anything you want to be, a testament to the fact that this boundless potential can just as easily flow into dark channels as it can into light ones. For later generations of immigrants, particularly Italian Americans, his legacy is a source of deep conflict. He is a part of their history, a man who emerged from their community and, for a time, wielded immense power in a society that often marginalized them. Yet he also perpetuated damaging stereotypes that they have spent decades trying to overcome. The popular culture machine has further polished this ambiguous legend, sanding down the rough, brutal edges of his reality and reshaping him into the cerebral, almost heroic figure of films and television. He is consistently portrayed as the smartest man in the room, the strategic genius who brought order to chaos, while the visceral human cost of his actions, the addicted, the exploited, the murdered, fades into the background. This sanitization allows us to consume his story as a thrilling narrative of power and strategy without being forced to fully grapple with its moral consequences. He becomes a symbol of a bygone era of crime, one that seems almost gentlemanly compared to the random, senseless violence that often dominates headlines today, a time when gangsters had codes and wore tailored suits, a romanticized fiction that overlooks the fact that the suits were paid for with blood money. Furthermore, in an age of increasing disillusionment with large institutions, governments, corporations, banks, Luciano's story of building a parallel, hyper-efficient shadow state holds a certain transgressive appeal. He represents a form of ultimate agency, a man who refused to accept the limitations imposed upon him by society and instead built his own world, answerable to no one. This taps into a latent fantasy of autonomy and power that exists in a complex, often overly regulated modern world. The legal and institutional legacy he provoked is equally a part of his enduring presence. The very laws and law enforcement techniques that were created to destroy his creation, from Raicho to the Witness Protection Program, are a permanent part of the American justice system, ensuring that his influence, however indirect, continues to be felt in courtrooms to this day. Ultimately, Lucky Luciano endures because he is more than a man. He is an idea. He is the idea that organization can be more powerful than brute force, that ambition is an immoral fire that can forge empires in the shadows, and that the pursuit of power, in its purest form, requires the sacrifice of humanity itself. He forces us to question our definitions of success and to acknowledge the dark, seductive allure of power attained outside the boundaries of law and morality. His grave may be a quiet, modest affair, but his specter looms large, a permanent and unsettling fixture in the American imagination, a reminder that the most dangerous criminals are not those who break the laws, but those who are clever enough to rewrite them for their own purposes. The final measure of lucky Luciano's historical significance lies not in the fleeting terror of his reign, but in the permanent and profound alterations he inflicted upon the structures of both crime and the state that opposed it. A dual legacy that cements his status as a pivotal, if dark, architect of 20th century America. To assess his impact is to observe a fundamental before and after divide in the annals of organized crime. Before Luciano, it was a parochial, tribal endeavor, a series of neighborhood fiefdoms plagued by constant, destabilizing warfare. After Luciano, it was a national corporate entity, a cold, calculating business model that could infiltrate and corrupt the highest levels of society with systematic precision. This was his primary, undeniable innovation, the corporatization of illicit power. He was the first to fully grasp that sustained, large-scale criminal enterprise required the same principles as a successful multinational corporation: a clear hierarchy, defined profit centers, strategic long-term planning, and a reliable mechanism for conflict resolution. The commission was not merely a council of gangsters. It was a board of directors for a shadowy conglomerate, and its creation was as revolutionary in the underworld as the formation of Standard Oil was in the legitimate business world. This model proved so resilient and effective that it governed American organized crime for the next 5 decades, surviving his exile, imprisonment, and death, and providing a template that would be studied and emulated by criminal organizations across the globe. His influence, however, did not stop at the water's edge of the underworld. It forced the legitimate world to evolve in response. The sheer sophistication and insulation of the system he built rendered traditional law enforcement methods, racking up arrests for individual crimes, almost entirely obsolete. You could not stop a corporation by arresting a few of its low-level employees. This existential challenge to justice catalyzed a legal and tactical revolution. The development of the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, the RICO statute, was the direct and necessary counter to Luciano's corporate model. It was a legal framework designed to attack the entire organization as a continuing criminal enterprise, precisely because taking down its CEO through conventional means had proven so difficult. Similarly, the formalization of the Federal Witness Protection Program was a direct response to the Code of Omerta that Luciano so staunchly upheld, a systematic effort to break the cultural and psychological bonds that held his organization together. The very techniques of modern law enforcement, long-term electronic surveillance, deep undercover operations, financial forensic accounting, and the focus on conspiracy charges were all refined and amplified in the protracted war against the creature Luciano had built in a very real sense. The modern FBI and federal prosecutorial power were shaped in the forge of battling his creation. His legacy also forces a permanent and uncomfortable footnote in American military history. The World War II alliance with the Navy remains a stark example of realpolitik, a case study in the moral compromises a nation is sometimes willing to make in its hour of existential peril. It forever blurs the clean, heroic narrative of the good war, introducing a shadowy, ambiguous figure whose contribution, while substantiated by official reports, sits uneasily in the national conscience. This episode ensures that Luciano is not just a domestic criminal, but a figure of international intrigue, whose reach extended into the highest levels of global conflict. On a societal level, his empire's deep and enduring corruption of labor unions, political machines, and key industries demonstrated with terrifying clarity the vulnerability of democratic institutions to organized, well-funded criminal infiltration. He proved that corruption could be not just a sporadic failing, but a systemic, managed operation, a lesson that has informed both subsequent criminal enterprises and the agencies tasked with preventing them. The cultural legacy is equally immense. He provided the blueprint for the modern archetype of the gangster, as a sophisticated boardroom strategist, an image that has been endlessly reproduced in literature, cinema, and television, from The Godfather to The Sopranos, shaping the public's perception of organized crime for generations. In the end, Lucky Luciano's life stands as a monumental paradox. He was a man of immense destructive power who, through the sheer force of his innovation, inadvertently spurred the creation of the very legal and law enforcement tools that would eventually cripple his own creation. He was a corrosive influence on society who nonetheless achieved a dark form of immortality, his name synonymous with the very concept of organized crime. To study him is to study a watershed moment, a before and after, where American crime was professionalized, and in response, American justice was forced to professionalize in turn, leaving behind a legacy that is as complex, contradictory, and enduring as the man himself. The story of Lucky Luciano, when stripped of its mythologized veneer and viewed in the stark light of historical totality, resolves into a profoundly human tragedy of Shakespearean dimensions, a cautionary epic about the isolating nature of absolute power and the ultimate emptiness of a legacy built solely on fear and transaction. He was a man who mastered the world but lost himself in the process, a king who built an empire only to be exiled from it, a visionary whose creation ultimately betrayed him. The central tragedy of his life lies in the fundamental contradiction between his immense personal ambition and the sterile, paranoid existence that ambition necessitated. He craved power and respect, and he achieved them on a scale few could imagine. Yet the power he wielded was of such a corrosive nature that it precluded any form of genuine human trust or affection. He could not have true friends, only allies whose loyalty was contingent on his continued power and their personal profit. He could not have a wife or children, for they would become levers to be used against him. He could not even fully enjoy the vast wealth he accumulated, as its display would draw the unwanted attention of the authorities he worked so hard to corrupt and evade. His life, for all its external trappings of success, was one of profound isolation, a gilded cage of his own making, where every relationship was a calculation and every smile potentially masked a dagger. This isolation only deepened with his deportation, the final, cruel reward for a lifetime of striving. He was physically severed from the vibrant, chaotic energy of New York City, the only environment that truly understood him and where he felt fully alive. In Italy, he was a relic, a museum piece, a famous American gangster, forced to play the part for journalists and tourists while his heart ached for the streets that had forged him. The betrayal by Vito Genovese and the subsequent erosion of his authority within the commission he had founded was the final, deeply personal wound. It was the ultimate proof that the system he built, founded on pragmatic self-interest and the ruthless elimination of rivals, contained the seeds of its own inevitable treachery. He had replaced the old world codes of honor with a new world code of profit, and in doing so, he created a monster that was logically bound to consume its creator. There is a profound pathos in the image of the aging Luciano in Naples, reading newspaper accounts of the Appalachian meeting debacle, seeing the empire he structured with such care being run into the ground by lesser, greedier men, his life's work unraveling due to the very hubris he had sought to eliminate. His death on the cold floor of an airport, a place of transit and temporary stays, was a metaphor for his entire existence. Perpetually in between, never truly at home, forever suspended between his past power and his present irrelevance. The tragedy extends beyond the man to the countless lives his empire consumed. For every moment of strategic brilliance Luciano exhibited in a corporate boardroom, there were 100 moments of silent despair in the lives he ruined. The addict dying in a gutter, the family grieving a murdered son, the community terrorized by his foot soldiers. His story is a powerful rebuttal to the romanticized notion of the noble gangster. There was nothing noble about the human misery he systematized for profit. The final, great irony is that the very qualities that made him so formidably successful, his pragmatism, his intelligence, his detachment, were the same qualities that rendered his life, in the most human sense, a failure. He achieved the American dream through a dark mirror, amassing wealth and power, but in the process, he sacrificed his humanity, his home, and his happiness. He died a free man, but he was a prisoner of his own notoriety and his own past. He is remembered as a legend, but the legend is one of loneliness and betrayal. A stark reminder that the pursuit of power for its own sake is a hollow quest that ultimately leaves the pursuer with nothing but the echoes of their own ambition and the chilling silence of a life lived without love or genuine connection. The true story of Lucky Luciano is not one of triumph, but of a magnificent and terrible waste. A demonstration that the most formidable empire is worthless if its architect has no one to share it with and no soul left to enjoy it. And so we arrive at the end of our journey, a journey that began in the hopeful, anxious heart of a young immigrant boy and concluded in the lonely, exiled stillness of an old man's death, a narrative arc that spans the tumultuous birth of modern America and leaves in its wake a legacy as complex and contradictory as the nation itself. The story of Lucky Luciano is not a simple parable of good versus evil, but a sprawling, ambiguous epic that holds a dark mirror to the American soul, reflecting our deepest anxieties about power, success, immigration, and the often blurred line between ambition and corruption. He was a product of his time, a creature forged in the brutal inequalities of the early 20th century, who looked upon the world he was given and decided to remake it in his own ruthless image. In doing so, he achieved a form of immortality, but it is an immortality steeped in shadow, his name forever synonymous with the cold, calculated architecture of organized crime. The empire he built, the commission, the corporate ladder of his families, the very idea of crime as a business, did not die with him. It evolved, it adapted, and it faced the legal onslaught it had provoked. But the blueprint was his, and its fundamental principles governed the underworld for decades. His life forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the nature of power, that it is often best wielded not through mindless brutality, but through chilling intelligence and strategic foresight, and that the most dangerous individuals are not those who disrupt the system, but those who understand it well enough to hijack it for their own purposes. He demonstrated that the American virtues of innovation, organization, and entrepreneurial drive are in themselves moral forces that can be harnessed for profoundly destructive ends. The gleaming skyscrapers of modern Manhattan stand as a testament to one kind of American dream, while the ghost of Lucky Luciano whispers of another, a parallel history of power built in backrooms and on blood-soaked streets, a history that is just as integral to understanding the nation's character. His enduring presence in popular culture, from films to television to literature, ensures that this conversation continues, that each new generation grapples with the myth and the reality of the man who organized American crime. But as we close this chapter, let us not forget the human cost that underpins the legend, the countless unnamed and forgotten victims whose suffering was the price paid for his power. Let us remember that behind the strategic genius was a man who ultimately died alone, estranged from his homeland and betrayed by his own creation, a tragic figure whose immense gifts were twisted towards ends that left the world a more corrupt and violent place. The tale of Lucky Luciano serves as a permanent caution, a reminder that the pursuit of power, when utterly divorced from morality and human connection, is a hollow and self-devouring enterprise. It is a story that began with a ship carrying a hopeful child towards the Statue of Liberty and ended with a coffin being lowered into the soil of a queen's cemetery, a journey from light into shadow and back again, leaving behind an indelible mark on history and a question that echoes through the ages. What is the true cost of a life lived without a soul? This has been the story of Lucky Luciano, the architect. We have presented this narrative based on extensive historical research, with the sole aim of bringing a comprehensive account to you. If you found this journey through one of history's most complex and shadowy chapters engaging, please show your support by liking this video, subscribing to the channel for more deep dives into forgotten histories and compelling biographies, and clicking the bell icon so you never miss a new story. Your engagement helps us continue to bring these meticulously researched narratives to light. Thank you for listening.